Let's consider the oyster. It possesses one of the most culturally versatile backgrounds of any food in human history, evolving from an ancient survival staple to a luxury delicacy, a democratic street food, and finally a symbol of modern ecological restoration. Look at that clam feast there, oyster feast there. And this guy, Baltimore Oysters, a little ad for this company. Here's oyster cellars in Italy. Here's another guy selling them, I guess, on the street, serving them up. Yeah, right, street food, street vendor. Ah, Desire, look at this. This is an ad card for a hotel in New Orleans, and these are New Orleans Mardi Gras beads. An oyster and a pearl. This is a brass oyster shell. I think it was used as a cigarette tray, ashtray. Be on oysters. We have lots of cans of oysters. That one's right. Bivalve, Maryland. And lots of cans. This is one of the styles of, we'll get into this in a minute, growing them on strings. This is where another style, and we'd start them at a little, and then they would grow them in these bags. I got a bunch of tools here for opening them. This oyster never got open. We never used these tools. This was a really iron, very heavy, old oyster shucking knife. Two more modern ones. Here's a couple of old tools. This is a French oyster hammer, and this is one from Chesapeake Bay. And you can see they would hammer. Sometimes these oysters would grow in clusters like this, and so they would bang them apart, and then measure them to see if they were the right size. Here, right there. These are, oyster hammers. Let's look at the slideshow here. So clams and oysters, they're both bivalve mollusks, but they're different, significant in their shells, habits, and flavor. Both live in fresh water, and salt water can live. Now clams are, mobile, burrowing in sand. Look at this. The birth of love. In Greek mythology, Aphrodite emerged from the ocean's white foam and rode an oyster shell to the shore. Because she was born from the sea, oceanic elements were believed to be infused with her powers of love and romance. And then the Casanova effect. The folklore has persisted for centuries. Historic figures like the infamous lover Casanova claimed to eat up to 60 oysters a day to sustain his passions. And here's some Franz Mears the Elder, the oyster meal. Look at this guy looking at her. She's having some oysters. And Jan Steen, the oyster eater, a girl offering oysters. All Dutch masters. So the Romans were arguably history's most enthusiastic oyster lovers. They harvested native flat oysters from British waters like Whitstable Bay and transported them across the empire packed in snow. And then the first aquaculture, a Roman entrepreneur, Sergius Orata, is credited with inventing the first commercial oyster farming systems around 90 BC using hanging nets. You can see a little bit about that there. And this is a floor mosaic showing a Roman dining room. Oysters and other types of shellfish scatter the unswept ground and indicate the importance of oysters in Roman times. Fun book, The Oyster, Where, How, and When to Find, Breed, Cook, and Eat It, London. This is like an 1880s book. This is the frontispiece page. Isn't that just wonderfully illustrated? Here's one of the first pages. So here's various scenes of oyster production. This is a dredging fork that they would drag over the sea. This is Chesapeake Bay. Here's these rakes that they would use. Look at these guys on both sides of the boat. Here's another using these rakes, raking for oysters. And then there's these kind of nets where they grow the oysters. They put them in and then they put them down in the sea and they grow larger. But they can control where they are. Yeah, it was a working class staple during the 1800s. Oysters were cheap and abundantly harvested from massive reefs in the Chesapeake Bay and New York Harbor, and became a street food. Very common to see this scene, and if you were around in those days. And look, here they are, excited. First day of oysters, a London street scene. Look at them all leaning in and eager to get the first taste of the oysters in the London oyster season. Another scene of a market with several oyster sellers there. There they're selling them, and here they're preparing them. You can eat them right on the spot. Outbreaks of typhoid fever and other illnesses persuaded the U.S. Congress to pass pure food laws in 1906 with lots of regulations, including regulating oyster beds, packing houses, shellfish sources, shipping methods, and labels. So then, to restore confidence, the oyster industry publicized the sanitary conditions under which their oysters were handled, and they put them right. The information was right on the tins, packers' tins, and the certification numbers, etc. Here's a shipping barrel, early 1900s of oysters, how they were shipped. So yes, with the railroads, oysters were kept and fed. They were fed and kept in seaweed and I guess ice, and they were shipped across the country. So just like with wine, terroir, oysters possess miroir. I didn't know that term. The distinct flavor profile imparted by specific water temperature, salinity, and mineral content. So basically, this created a very competitive and wonderful variation of oysters from different places. And so when you go to an oyster bar, you can order oysters from different parts of the country, and you will get a different taste. Here, look, they're growing oysters on those ropes. Sort of a variation of what I have here. In Thailand, here's an oyster culture operation in France. And this is this Billion Oyster Project in New York City, a nonprofit which is trying to restore 1 billion live oysters to New York Harbor by 2035. And what they're doing is they're building up the marine ecosystem, clearing the water through natural filtration. That's what the oysters do. So they're collecting all these shells, creating these environments in which they can then seed the area with oysters. So look, this is a huge project involving lots of university students, volunteers. Great project. The Billion Oyster Project, New York City. Mark Twain was a huge fan of oysters. Here's a bit of a description. He writes about them in Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Here's an oyster fork. Look at this beautiful oyster platter. And you put the oysters on there, and it looks like one scallop shell. Some of our oyster forks. The famous Grand Central Oyster Bar and Restaurant. Yeah, there's the bar part of it. Here's the menu from 2010. You can see not just oysters, but lobster and all-cooked shellfish. Wow. But it's referred to as the Oyster Bar. And a little bit of the history. The restaurant opened in February 1913, a few weeks after the completion of the terminal. Originally operated by the Union News Company, created to peak It created the peak of the long-distance train travel. New Yorkers were famously obsessed with bivalves. And then this 440-seat subterranean space renowned for its sweeping arches, Mediterranean-style interlocking terracotta tiles on the menu. Look at this. There's the chefs and the guy sitting at the bar. Here's some of the menus. I think that's a special one for the Thanksgiving. Celebrated. New Yorker made fun, not made fun, but was showing the oyster bar. Look at that. New York's most famous seafood restaurant. There's another view of that cantilevered, beautiful ceiling and the bar, and then the restaurant tables beyond. Now, various businesses produce these trade cards featuring caricatures of this woman with her oyster-style haircut. Look at this guy with his oyster banjo, I guess. These kids. Aren't these just beautiful? Look at the lemon that they're squeezing. Just beautiful cards. All from like the late 1890s. How to shuck an oyster. Here's how you do it. Here's these. Here's an oyster shucking knife. These guys are professionals. But one of the problems was took advantage of child labor and very hard work. Here's the variations of some of our collection of oyster shucking knives. The early tools crafted by a blacksmith using iron rods featured one tapered end to pry open the blunt end for cracking alpha shells. And then, so there's the different styles. The problem was oysters became a staple food during the 1800s. Specialized shucking houses popped up along the Gulf. African Americans were highly involved in the industry, but industrialization and child labor in the late 1920s. So massive canneries emerged using immigrant and child labor. And look at this. Historic photos from 1911 reveal families working grueling hours, prompting early child labor reforms. Look at that. So then, in modern times, you have oyster shucking contests. The U.S. National Oyster Shucking Championship going on there. You see that? And these two women are champion oyster shuckers. You can see their names. And then there's the World Oyster Shucking Championship occurs in Galway in Ireland. International Oyster Festival, part of it. And you have to not just shuck quickly, but you have to have them cleanly shucked and then a nice display of them. So it's not just primarily speed, but how the precision, but also how well judged, how well done the trays are. Some of the culinary references to angels on horseback, bacon-wrapped oysters, Hangtown fry, American egg, oyster, and bacon dish, omelets, sauces, vermicelli, noodle soup, oysters. Yeah, look at all these. Smoked oysters, that's another wonderful way to have it. And then oysters, Rockefeller, one of the famous New Orleans dishes. Oysters on the half shell that have been topped with various other ingredients, parsley, green herbs, rich butter sauce, breadcrumbs, and then they're baked and broiled. Oysters or Rockefeller. How about oyster seafood festivals? Look at this character at one of the seafood festivals. That's a really great costume. There's the annual U.S. Oyster Festival in St. Mary's County, Maryland. And the posters are just so full of variety and good artistic imagination for all of these different oyster festivals. Oysters are such a huge part of certainly American history that all of these historic markers are making reference to places and events where oysters were important. they grown or produced, or some evidence, some story. Gettysburg Campaign, Oyster Point. These places, people associated with oyster. Look, African-American oystermen. Just shows the importance of oysters, that they get their own historic markers to call attention to their heritage. There's Bivalve, New Jersey. I've been there. It's in South Jersey, off of the Cape there on the Delaware Bay. Famous for, I don't know, 100 years or more, 150 years of producing oysters, catching them in the, harvesting them in the bay in the process. Look at all these oyster boats, and then these are the places where they were processed on the big decks, and so this place has been preserved. Oh yeah, look, there's mountains and mountains of oyster shells. This goes for like a half a mile. It used to be bigger, and all these all these seagulls are there. It's really kind of a weird, creepy place. But on the other side is Delaware Bay. Here's some history of the shell pile. 1900s. Bivalve was the epicenter of the New Jersey oyster trade. Schooners brought in millions of bushels of oysters annually. The shucking community was where I just showed you. Largely African Americans did the job. The living conditions, massive industrial operation, was famously documented by photographers in the 1930s. And then the whole thing collapsed because of deadly oyster pathogens. But it's been a whole bunch of millionaires, mostly from Philadelphia, were controlling this business. The workers lived in wooden row houses and barracks built on stilts over the salt marshes. But the cultural resilience, and this now is wonderful, being preserved, and we're going to show you that, by the Bayshore Center at Bivalve. This preserves a real important bygone industry, and the sheds have been, the docks and the sheds have been preserved. They do tours. There's a wonderful museum about this area. There's a nice little cafe right on the dock, and they've got this preserved oyster schooner. You can take trips out on that, and then the museum has lots of exhibits about the oyster industry. Really impressed with how well they've done this whole installation, this Bayshore Center. How about this old sign? I don't know if it's old. It's made to look old. And look at the way they're in Gulf catching the oysters. That's some of the ships that would do that. Jonathan Swift famously wrote, he was a bold man that first ate an oyster. He overcame his fear of oysters to become a convert and enthusiastic advocate of oysters. And in his book, Gulliver's Travels, the main character and ship's captain, Gulliver, became shipwrecked and landed at a place called Lilliput, where he collected and ate raw oysters on the beach in order to conserve his food provisions. And this is a wonderful face of a oyster eater. Look at these folks. Very intense on experiencing and tasting and enjoying oysters. And here's, of course, the oyster catcher feeding techniques. A long bill was able to, was in the beach tidal areas, as the oysters were still kind of soggy and a little bit wet and be open, the oyster catcher would pry open even further. The hatcheries and spats, rather than relying on wild populations, most modern farmers source larvae from hatcheries, and they set the tiny shell fragments to become spat or seed, and they put them on these nets. Here's a copy of one here. We have that. And so they grow inside there, and look at how long these are. So that's some very modern way to grow out oysters in these tumble cages, log line systems. And the gentle waves tumbles the oysters, chipping away at their thin outers and forcing them to grow deep cup-shaped and strong, so the ocean currents and the way that they're growing them produces a stronger shell. After explaining the benefits of oyster aquaculture, the shellfish play a critical role in marine habitats that they can improve the water quality. Look at that. One adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day and provide food and support livelihood for whole communities, provide habitat and increase biodiversity for all the other creatures. Want to know more? Mark Kolansky has written some great books on seafood, and this is The Big Oyster History on the Half Shell. And then MFK Fisher, one of our favorite artists, I think back in the 40s, wrote this, Consider the Oyster. So there you have it, our big show about oysters, because oysters is a big, huge, important topic. If you like these shows, you can subscribe on YouTube. They're free. It's a free service. You can also leave us comments. You can tell your friends about what we're trying to do. All of our artifacts that we're doing, we're showing all of our seafood, many of our seafood artifacts, and doing lots of shows on seafood. This is all, we hope to find a home, a community, or a university of food studies that would accept all of our food artifacts and archives and libraries. So if you know, help us find a future home for all of this. And this is just some of our seafood stuff. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy your oysters.